when we say something in our speech, people may or may not believe us. But if we can get the audience to say something, they will start believing it. Will sound true and correct to them. Because that's our nature. If we say something over and over again, after a while, it sounds right. It sounds true. So if you want to drive a change in your audience, change them from where they are to something else, it helps a lot to get them to repeat things. Get your audience to say things back. You can underline important messages in your speech. You can make clear what the point of your speech is. You can get the audience buying in and agreeing to your main points. And it's very effective in keeping your audience involved in your speech. Because one challenge today as a speaker is that there's so many things that can distract your audience. There's PDAs, cell phones, MP3 players, and numerous other technological gadgets out there. So instead of listening to your speech, people are doing one of these numbers. One way to get them to put that down is to keep away to put down that shit along in there and focus on what we're talking. It's really wonderful. But it's aerobics. Yes, and over things and make them more complex or make them uncomfortable are going to find that the audience doesn't want to participate and they're beginning to not like that speaker. So make sure all the interactions you have are relevant to your speech. The three things we're going to be talking today about are repetition, connection, and pattern. First, repetition. If you can get the audience to repeat things, and a simple way to do it is you just tell them what you want to repeat and they just say it back to you. Simple repetition. Talk more about that in depth. The idea is you want to make sure the audience knows what to do and then they do it. Or connection. Drawing a connection between what you're doing on stage, what's going on in their head, and based on that, they know what to say. And then pattern. They just get in the habit of knowing what's going to come next. And finally, they fill in the blank instead of the speaker. Three different methods, different, but with the same goal of interconnecting the audience with the speaker, of focusing the audience on what the speaker is saying and getting the speaker's point. Getting the audience to repeat things is very powerful, very useful, and fortunately, it's pretty easy. You have to make it clear what you want, but you make it clear, the audience usually is okay with doing what you want. As mentioned, don't overdo it. Talk about some of the dangers of that. Don't overdo things, but if you use it and use it well, it can be very, very effective. So today you will learn about how to get the audience to respond effectively using repetition, connection, and pattern. One of the simplest ways to get the audience to repeat after you is to say what you want them to say and get them to say it. It's this type of repetition that can really work well. And sometimes it's as simple as, give me an A, give me a B. You've seen cheerleaders do it all the time. They tell the audience exactly what they want, and then the audience responds. Now, if you're a new speaker, you might think, why would the audience do that? What does it matter? What if I ask them for something and they don't do it? Relax. The good news is that your audience really wants to respond. Most audiences do. Because they're bored. They're just sitting there. They're just listening to you. Remember, always remember, what's in it for me is the most important question the audience has. So if they get a chance to make a little noise and yell, they're excited. They're getting involved in the speech. They're a part of the speech. It's not all about you, the speaker. It's also about them, the audience. And that excites them. So if you tell them what you want them to say, they're going to say it. If you say, most important thing you have to learn today in life is to have power. What do you have to have? Give a gesture. Gestures can help a lot. So, give me an A. That throwing gesture can be very effective. Or sometimes just a gesture like this. Whatever you do, make it very clear you're gesturing out in an open sort of a way. If you simply say, give me an A, and then wait, audience won't know when to respond. So you have to make it very clear as to when they're going to respond. They want to repeat what you say. They really do. But you have to make it simple for them. The most important thing in using repetition is to make sure you keep it simple. Keep it clear. Here's what I want you to say. Here's the time to say it. That's what your audience is looking for. That type of clarity, that type of very clear sense of this is what I'm going to do. Because nobody out there wants to look like a fool. And if the person next to them isn't yelling, they're not going to yell. So you want to make it safe. Most important thing you want to get your audience to respond is to keep it safe. You want to get your audience to say something, to respond to you, make sure it's a safe, easy environment. Simplest way is to give them clear directions. And to give clear directions, it helps to keep it short. If the directions are too long, there's a problem. Steve Martin, the comedian, has a joke in which he does the call and response, where he calls out something, gets the audience to respond, and he demonstrates very clearly the problem of making things too long. Steve starts out and says, "Hello, Crime Stoppers!" Well, the audience has no idea what to do. Some say hello, some ignore him. He ignores whatever the audience does and says, "Usually we say, 'Hi, Steve. I'll try it again.'" And when he does that, he's letting the audience know, okay, I messed up. I'm going to tell you what to do. When I say this, you say that. So he says, "Hello, Crime Stoppers!" And the whole audience yells, "Hi, Steve! Let's repeat the Crime Stoppers oath," says Steve. The audience waits. Okay, we know we're about to repeat something. Says, "I promise not to leave my keys in the car." Very simple, very clear. The audience can easily repeat that. The audience says, "I promise not to leave my keys in the car." Little long, but they get it mostly out. Then he says, "I promise not to depreciate non-taxable items brought forth in the previous tax year." Well, the audience, of course, some break out laughing, some try to repeat it. It's a complete mess. It was too long, it was too complex. So when you're using repetition, make it very clear. Say, this is what I want you to do, this is when I want you to do it, and it's clear, it's simple, and it's short enough the audience can easily say it. If you can help your audience make a connection between what you're doing up here and what they're supposed to say, you can make it even easier. You can use a gesture or a phrase, and then they'll know what's going to happen next. They'll know what they're expected to do. And it works the same way as we talked about with repetition. You still want to repeat this gesture you're using. And then you want to get the audience to associate that gesture with something. You want them to make a connection. So in their head, every time they see that gesture, they know what it means. And then you just get them to respond, to say. Now it's a little bit more complex. It takes a little bit more work than simply saying, give me an A, give me a B. A little bit more work than that, but it can be useful in certain situations. If you're trying to describe different ways of doing things, different methods, and you want them to understand those methods, you can develop a gesture. So if you're talking about speaking, and you want the audience to become better speakers, you can talk about the importance of needing to have structure. And this could be your structured gesture. The idea that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's structure. Now as you go through your speech, you repeat that gesture over and over. So we have a structure. And every time you do that, we have structure. So, as you know, the important thing in speech is we need to have a... Then you indicate the audience they're supposed to respond, structure. Now, it's a little bit more involved for the audience because they have to really think through what they're doing. But if you lay it out the same sort of careful way, not make it too big, not make it too complex, they can start to associate gestures with needing to have a response. So if you're talking about building a structure, that's your gesture for structure. So now in speaking, we need to have a structure. And then you can have another gesture. Talk about you need to be expansive. So you use this as the expansive gesture, perhaps. So every time the audience sees this, they know they're supposed to respond. At first, you're going to have to cue them to respond. But after a while, they'll get it. Next time you do this, say expansive. This, they'll say structure. And that's how you can take gestures and connect them with your speech. But again, to make this work, and make it work well, you're going to have to train your audience very carefully. Make sure you do it early. You set up this sense of, okay, this means connection. This means expansive. Once the audience understands that, then you can get them to respond later. And the advantage about this method of connection is you can take some kind of complex ideas and get them in the audience's head. And you're reinforcing things two ways. One, by the word. So the audience gets the word in their head. But two, by the gesture. If you can make a connection between your gestures and a different concept or a different idea, then you reinforce twice. Reinforce it once by saying the word, reinforce it again by having this new gesture. So this is a tool you can use to get the audience to respond, to help them make that connection with you and with your speech. And the third thing you can do is to create a pattern. Pattern is where you say the same thing over and over and over and over again throughout your entire speech. And in all situations, you get your audience to say that same thing. So you cue your audience over and over again. You set them up over and over again. They say the same thing over and over again. You create a pattern. And in the beginning, you say the same thing over and over again, but eventually your audience catches on. It's going to be tremendously effective because it really pounds that message home. Whatever you get your audience to say over and over again. great example of pattern was Ed Tate, a world champion of public speaking, in his World Championship speech called One of Those Days. In this speech, Ed Tate sets up the phrase, one of those days, and he gets his audience to say it over and over and over again throughout his speech. He makes the audience do this because he knows the audience already knows that phrase, one of those days. It's something that's already in the audience's head. We've all said it before. Having one of those days. You ever have one of those days? All know what that means. A day that's frustrating and difficult, where things don't go right, where nothing ever seems to go right, and just the day keeps on stretching longer and longer. That's what one of those days means. So everybody in the audience understands that phrase. So Ed Tate says, boy, I'm having one of those days. He sets it up with the normal situation. He gets stopped by a cop, and the cop gives him a speeding ticket. So, having one of those days. This speeding ticket makes him late to the airport, so he can't catch his plane. One of those days. He gets up there to the ticket counter and finds out that there are no planes available. One of those days. By that time, Ed Tate has set up this pattern. So he's saying, boy, I was just having, and the whole audience says, one of those days. And they set it up all the way through the speech. This is what happens with one of those days. But because Ed has pounded this message into the audience all the way through, he forces the audience at some point to think about one of those days. What does that really mean? Does it mean good? Does it mean bad? What if you took a bad one of those days and turned it into a good one of those days? What would that be like? And he sets this idea up in the audience's head. So now when they say one of those days, it can have a completely different meaning. Because good things actually came out of Ed missing his flight. He missed his flight, but he got bumped up to a first-class flight instead of the coach class he was on. He was able to stand up to somebody who was trying to bully him. And he was made a hero in front of the airport. This was also part of one of those days. And the genius is in Ed drawing the connection between one of those days when bad things happen, one of those days when good things happen. And so at the very end of his speech, the last thing Ed leaves you with is, I hope you have one of those days. Meaning, I hope everything turns out well for you. But it's by setting up this pattern over and over and over again of one of those days, it enables Ed to transform the speech and get the audience really thinking in a completely different way. That's the power of the pattern. You set the pattern up, you get the audience to respond, and then at the end they're thinking in a completely different way. And they're focused in on you and your message. So when you're trying to get the audience to respond, remember the power of the pattern. Repetition, connection, and pattern. These three things can help your audience to get involved with your speech. Focus in on the things that you're saying. Because if you can get your audience to repeat what you have to say, if you can get them to say it, then it becomes more real in their mind. It becomes more true in their head. If you can get them to say what you want them to say. And there are three ways to do it we talked about today. There are others. You can figure out some others or discover some others, but three ways can get you started down that path to developing your audience. And one of them, repetition. Just say something, get the audience repeating. Very, very simple. You say it, the audience repeats it, they know what to say, they know when to say it, no problem. It's used by cheerleaders, it's used by anybody who wants to get that response. It's like, give me an A, give me a B, B. There's that instant response from the audience. And it works because the audience wants to get involved. They really do. They really want to get involved and become part of things, because just sitting there listening is boring, is dull. So if you give them a part in your speech, you give them something to do, and it pulls them in, gets them interested. Another thing you can use is connection. If you can draw a connection between what you're talking about and show them the gesture, what you're doing, it can help. Because then they have this reinforcement. You're saying it and they're seeing it. And if you can get to say them back, even better. So if you get them to know that this is connection, you can say, you always want to have a, and they'll all say connection, with your audience. Because they know now this gesture is connection. Or if you want to talk about organization, this gesture is organization, they'll know to use that gesture. Now to make this work, you have to set it up early. Set it up early in the speech so they understand what to do when it occurs. Don't set it up early, there can be problems. And the last thing we talked about is pattern. Pattern is one of the most powerful things, and something that takes a little bit of patience to get your audience through, and takes a little bit of trust that you can actually do it. Pattern is where you get your audience to respond over and over and over again. It's the same thing. You draw that sense of, here's what I want you to do at the beginning, and you get them to do it over and over and over. Now, as we talked about, it helps if you make it something they already say, or they already know what to say. Then you don't have any real education involved, you just have to get them to say it. I gave the example of Ed Tate in his speech, one of those days. Everybody in the audience at some time in their life has said, I'm having one of those days. What Ed Tate got him to do was to say, one of those days. And it was so natural, it was so simple, the audience very quickly started doing it easily whenever Ed wanted them to do it, by setting up that pattern. You can get your audience to do that. Get your audience to say what you want them to say. Get your audience to repeat after you. It helps reinforce the message into their head. It helps sink it into their head and reinforce the message of your speech. It helps make your point. Remember, for your next speech, remember these simple magic words. Repeat after me.